Good evening, everybody. This is Michael Rooks from the High Museum of Art. I'm the Wieland Family Curator of Contemporary and Modern Art at the High Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, which is sponsored by the Jane F. and Clayton F. Jackson Conversations with Contemporary Artists Endowment. And tonight we are highlighting an exhibition, our current exhibition, which is titled What Is Left Unspoken, Love, curated by yours truly and organized by the High Museum of Art. It's a 30-year survey of contemporary art featuring the work of 35 artists and organized through the lens of 6 overlapping and at times contradictory ideas that provide categories that allow us to grapple with some of the most firmly rooted concepts of love today. Major funding for the exhibition is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts, with additional funding by the Taylor Family Fund. The exhibition is also made possible by the High's premier sponsors, Delta Airlines, our premier supporters, ACT Foundation, Inc., Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Louise Sams, and Jérôme Griot, the estate of Joan H. Weens, Wish Foundation, and Harry Norman Realtors. And our benefactor supporters are Robin and Hilton Howell. A big thanks also to our ambassador and contributing series supporters as well. And finally, a heartfelt thank to the High Museum members, in attendance this evening. We thank you. We can't do what we do without you. In fact, we do what we do for you. So if you're not a member yet, or if you need to renew, please visit high.org after the program tonight. So this evening, we are privileged to be joined by artist Rashid Johnson. Johnson received his BA in photography from Columbia College in Chicago and did his postgraduate work at the School of the Art Institute in 2005, and was included in 2001 in the groundbreaking exhibition Freestyle at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which was curated by Thelma Golden. The exhibition featured 28 artists brought together under a rubric described by the expression post-Black, a term that Golden described as, quote, characterized by artists who were adamant about not being labeled as Black artists, though their work was steeped in fact, deeply interested in redefining complex notions of Blackness, unquote. And at 24, Johnson was the youngest artist in the exhibition. He presented works from his series, Seeing in the Dark, which were photographs created in the antique Van Dyke Brown process featuring African-American men in Chicago who were homeless. And although homeless, the men were not portrayed as anonymous faces, but were given the dignity of their names, and among them were George, Michael, Cornelius, and Jonathan, for example. Since then, Johnson's work has become central to post-conceptual art practice today. Johnson's work is discursive, and his practice incorporates a wide range of everyday materials and objects, including wax and wood, steel, brass, black soap, and shea butter, ceramic tile, books, vinyl LPs, VHS tapes, living plants, and CB radios, among other things, for example. He works across platforms from writing to performance to painting, sculpture and drawing, to feature filmmaking, which we'll hear a little bit about. And he's inspired by things like mystical practices, Afrofuturism, literature and philosophy, music, film, recent art history, and African-American history, just to name a few of his interests. Johnson's recent work deploys materials across platforms in a way that is open-ended and polyvalent. And his work is as much about notions of Blackness as it is about, for example, the minimalist sculpture of Carl Andre or Solowit. His work can seem quite familiar on one hand because of its materiality, but can lead to interpretations that are critical and conceptual, spiritual, or somatic in nature. Recent exhibitions include Rashid Johnson Waves at London's Hauser and Wirth, the traveling exhibition Rashid Johnson, The Hikers, important for us for this exhibition, which was first shown at the Aspen Art Museum and then the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, Hauser and Wirth again in New York, and then later at Storm King, a sculpture park in upstate New York in 21. Other exhibitions include Provocations, Rashid Johnson at ICA Richmond in our neck of the woods here in the Southeast, and Rashid Johnson, No More Water at Lismore Castle in Ireland. Among those exhibitions, we did not include, of course, the very important 2012 exhibition that the MCA Chicago organized, which was his first survey exhibition called Rashid Johnson, Message to Our Folks, which traveled to the High Museum of Art in 2013. Additionally, in 2012, Rashid Johnson became the High Museum's 8th Driscoll Prize recipient. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Driscoll Prize, it's the first national prize to honor and celebrate contributions to both the field of African-American art and scholarship. And it was established at the High in 2005 in honor of the late artist and scholar David C. Driscoll. So with all of that, Rashid, welcome. Thank you for allowing us to include your work in this exhibition. We're so grateful, and it is like the heart of our exhibition, if you ask me.
I couldn't be happier to be with you, Michael. Thanks for including me both in the exhibition and asking me to come speak with you today.
Well, I appreciate it, especially on a week evening. I thought we'd start out talking about although in our exhibition, we've included a film called The Hikers, which was produced in 2019. But I thought we'd start with a conversation about a few works you made prior to that film. And although you may be best known for your sculptural installation and photography, filmmaking has been integral to your work for at least a decade, maybe more. Films have included Sweet, Sweet Runner, which was shot in 16 millimeter. And I think that was included in Message to Our Folks.
It was.
And most recently, I'll go through the films that I've seen. Black Yoga, which was also included in Message to Our Folks. Fast forwarding to a more recent past, the HBO feature film, the remake of Native Son. Of course, The Hikers and Black and Blue, which is perhaps, I think, the most recent film you've made. So when I saw Native Son for the first time, a formal similarity struck me between the film and your monumental installation, like Antoine's Organ. And that is the multiple layers of reference to art history, literature, philosophy. Both works, the film and this monumental sculpture, serve as a scaffold, in a way, for the entirety of your oeuvre. So do you find connections between sculpture and film in your work? And if you do, how would you describe them?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the question. I do see, quite a bit of similarity between what it is and how it is I approach film and how it is I approach sculpture. And I would add even into to that conversation my interest in collage, my interest in music, and as you referenced, how literature then in some sense functions as a scaffold for almost all of those mediums to kind of come together, contradict one another. And like my friend Robert Longo once said about me and my work, it's about collision, right? At that point, I think that we have become so invested in this idea of integration in the arts, this ambition to see art practices leave their singular intention and be joined together in some ceremonious and harmonic engagement. My work doesn't ask for that, and it doesn't attempt to bring that to fruition. One of my goals, and one that's run through the vein of my project, and in that kind of rhizomic sense, has allowed and kind of been part of how the themes and ideas kind of carry on with one another, is that they are intended to create contradictory opportunities for exploration and the explosive agency that is born from those kind of conjured collisions in a sense. And Native Son, I think, is a really good reference point and place to discuss some of that, in that it, of course, takes as its launching pad the work by Richard Wright, Native Son, which, of course, has a quite sordid and complicated, rigorous, inventive, and important history, both in African-American communities as well as in the field of literature as a whole. The way Wright functions in some sense as an existentialist, right? Which he's rarely spoken about in those terms, right? Wright has a relationship to Camus. He then expatriates at a point to live in Paris with and around the folks to whom existentialist thought and kind of critical thought are often framed. So, you know, Wright is this character that expands beyond even his own kind of origin story, or what and how we have explored his origin story. It brings in to collision the work of James Baldwin, who at a stage writes a piece that kind of contradicts the concerns of Wright's novel and suggests that Wright's novel is a protest novel and lacks a certain sophistication and in its depiction of the complexity of the Black male and the conditions to which he's exposed, right? So that becomes part of this conversation. I then was able to bring in a woman named Susan Laurie Parks, who of course is a really quite important award-winning playwright who studied with James Baldwin. And we were able to kind of concoct a contemporary telling of Wright's story with Baldwin's concerns, not formally addressed, but considered, right? And so that kind of, that real world action that then leads into locations in Chicago that were integral to my development as an artist and as a person and as a growing person that are familiar from my youth through my graduate experience. And I've known you, Michael, for over 20 years in the arts, and you've been an incredible supporter of my work and of my thinking. So some of this is quite familiar to you. But yeah, so it's like the real world meets the literary world, meets invention, meets reinvention, meets structure, and to use a word that you used earlier, that I think is really high functioning for this conversation. It's about that armature.
Yeah, absolutely. And collision is a great word to use too, especially when I think about the opening sequence of Native Son. As you were alluding, Wright, I think, to some, still is who Kara Walker is to others. I mean, in other words, he's not James Baldwin and he's not Ralph Ellison.
Absolutely.
So it's not hard to see why writers like Ellison and Baldwin resisted Wright's existentialism, this existential vision of Black experience. But that was true to his own history of deprivation when he wrote this book. And at the start of the film, I was just really blown away when the character Biggers places his father's handgun on top of a copy of Ellison's Invisible Man. That's incredible. I mean, it just, oh. So what does this detail, what should this detail tell us about the narrative? I mean, it is literally like a collision right there.
It is, it really starts us off with the understanding that I know quite a bit about the tools that I'm employing when you come to this telling, right? That I'm aware of Ellison and Baldwin's kind of engagement with a person like Wright, and some of their frustration with Wright, as Wright kind of formed this fatherly character, this almost paternal character in Black literary circles. So in a sense, it was their opportunity, our Baldwin's in particular, to kind of attack his father, or to at least call into question his father's wisdom. And so those things are, fascinating. And then kind of the positioning of this weapon, right, on top of the work by Ellison, right? Right. Absolutely. And then, as you may recall, the character Ashton Sanders, who's playing Bigger, is then kind of coating his hands in shea butter in a really kind of disturbing fashion on top of several rings the character has, for the purpose of our telling, been recast as a punk, which is kind of an unexpected position for a Black character, or not a familiar telling of how a Black youth is imagined in the world. He takes on the kind of cloaking and the costuming of someone who's invested in a music that is incredibly radical and individual and complicated, but it is not hip hop, right? Yeah. So it's a music that has more history with white radical culture historically than it does with Black radical thinking, even though there's an argument to be made that Black radical thinking has influenced and been incredibly prescient to the development of that genre, being punk. But you have all these unexpected kind of positions being taken quite early in the film that give you a sense of the signifiers and the kind of loaded algorithm of tools that were going to inform how the story was going to come to life.
Right. I mean, we even see in one sequence Wright's book on the bookshelf, right? Invisible or Native Son, which was just wonderful. I had to replay it a couple times. Like, no way.
There's a lot of there are quite a few little kind of Easter eggs, I think people often refer to them as, throughout the film, whether it's my work, whether it's references to Wright, whether it's references to other texts, as well as art history and contemporary art histories, with the inclusion of other artists, whether it's Henry Taylor, Sam Gilliam, Glenn Ligon. There's all these kind of opportunities, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask Yadira if you would just show the slides to begin with. I had intended to show the slide of Antoine's organ earlier, but it's a good moment to show it as well. So this is an image of Antoine's organ in the museum exhibition, Grief and Grievance, which was the great Okwe and Wizor's last exhibition. And one of the things that I discovered, sadly I didn't see the exhibition, but one of the things in this, two things relevant, I guess, to our conversation, there's probably lots of relevant things, is that there's a copy of Kierkegaard's book, Concepts of Anxiety. In addition to the fact that the title, I'm assuming, refers to Antoine Baldwin, whose piano is in the center of the piece, and Antoine Baldwin is also the composer who wrote the score for The Hikers. So I'm just wondering if we can talk a bit about the anxiety as a subject. It's something that I think you first tackled in the 2015 Drawing Center exhibition titled Anxious Men, which had its own soundtrack by Melvin Van Peebles, I believe. But it seems to me that its presence in this sculpture installation kind of is part of that continuity you're talking about in your work, that while also being a scaffold, it is part of this continuity of ideas and images that cross media and platforms.
No, it's super interesting. I think you've hit on a lot of kind of micro details that really do begin to spin into the kind of macro opportunity that I'm trying to present in the work. I think there have been times when the work has been suggested to be opaque, and I really find it to be quite the opposite. I mean, I leave all of it out there to be examined. And to your point, Kierkegaard's book on anxiety kind of helps you walk through a lot of the antecedent and the kind of critical concerns that I was having, and then the actual practical concerns that I continue to have around how to navigate, through a world that's quite complicated. when I was 19, I flew to Senegal in West Africa. And on that trip, I was able to visit the home of the scholar, writer, thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois. And on that trip to visit Du Bois's home, the home to which he expatriated and lived out his last years, I discovered several texts by Kierkegaard, most of them in German. And I was then told that Du Bois, at the end of his life, learned to read German in order to be able to understand and interpret the work of Kierkegaard. And as you are familiar, much of German philosophy was late to be translated because there were a lot of terms and positions taken that were quite difficult. So the translations are quite important. But for Du Bois, it was important for him to learn German to the point where he could translate it himself. So also included in this work is the seminal text by Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, which is something that I've used quite a bit. And to just think about how we kind of conjure these groupings, these unexpected groupings that people may think are disparate in certain senses, but they're not disparate. I'm also the owner of, this goes a little bit into a wave, but I'm the owner of a book by that's Huckleberry Finn. I'm the owner of an older copy of Huckleberry Finn, but its previous owner is the 12-year-old Leroy Jones, who then becomes Amiri Baraka. And this is the story of literature. This is the story of art. This is like this is a historical understanding of the world and the ground to which we stand. Our teachers are not necessarily the people that people expect them to be. That Leroy Jones at 11, 12 years old is reading Huckleberry Finn. Whether he rejects, accepts, embraces, is disturbed by, or learns from this text is neither here nor there. His exposure is central to it. And so these ideas, and again, to get into both the thematic of scaffolding, the thematic of antecedent, the thematic of collision, like this is all like one large rhizomic vein, and we're all kind of on the road with any numbers and opportunities for exposure and engagement. And I'm learning, exploring, and kind of in a sculpture like this, creating a framework in a brain, a place to put ideas, a place to put concerns, a place to stage these kind of growing collisions.
Well said. I mean, wonderful. And we're going to show an image of anxious men in a moment, but just staying on with this piece, for me, in relation to Native Son, anxiety at this point, if we're fortunate enough to have seen this sculptural installation and to have seen Native Son, anxiety in a way seems to represent not racism per se, but the evil in a society that creates conditions in which people who don't suffer from injustice seem incapable of caring about those who do. Was that fair to kind of characterize one aspect of how anxiety functions as something in your work?
No, I absolutely appreciate that interpretation. I think anxiety is an opportunity to speak about the wholeness of concern, to think about fear, and to then personalize these positions. Because when we try oftentimes to describe the conditions of our experience to another, it can be hard to translate. It can be hard to be the victim of those positions, and it can be hard to feel that you are the perpetrator of those positions. And as an end around, or as a way to explore our own personal engagement and to turn into that more naveled position that people feel quite a bit of comfort in, I talk about something that is quite broad, right? And that broadness is exemplified by discussing anxiety, something that most of us are quite familiar with. and we can position ourselves towards it in a way that allows us to start to consider empathetically engaging with the critical concerns, the emotional and the personal concerns that may not belong to us, but belong to people who are adjacent to us. And so that's really how I kind of honestly unpack the position, right? It's for me a more kind of thoughtful and sincere way of saying, here are all of these things, like place any of them into this bucket and then start to kind of take them out, unpack them, and understand your relationship to them. And ideally, it allows you an opportunity to see yourself in my work and in some of the kind of critical concerns that are presented.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good segue to the next slide, which is a still from the sun. To me, this still conveys an incredible anxiety. Both me, as someone who's been in the position of the individual looking at the protagonist, you know, being at a party like this, and understanding this relationship, and in the film, of course, understanding that it's almost a violent kind of situation that this family has put this individual in. In the next still from the film, literally, this is the interview when Bigger is interviewing for his job with his family as a driver. And behind him, of course, is one of your Anxious Men paintings, which started out as self-portraits, I understand, or is that correct?
No, that's correct.
Yeah. So coming back to your reference to Du Bois, who is, for anyone who knows your work well, is absolutely this wonderful leitmotif throughout your work, and the souls of Black folk. Almost 120 years after its publication, we hear a quote from Bigger in your film, and so in this compression of time, it's almost as if, you know, this thesis, Du Bois's sociological thesis, is of course just as relevant today as it was almost 150 years ago. I think this quote from the film really sums it up, and that is, "Brand new game, same old shit." You know, it's almost as if you're anxious that you are behind him, you know, just warning him. It's like, hey, you are in a dire situation here. You're in a no-win situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's again one of those little Easter eggs. And for anyone who was familiar with my work previous to seeing the film, to see this Anxious Man hovering behind Bigger, kind of as this sense of warning, right? As he goes into this home, and however well-meaning these folks are, they are producing a scenario to which Bigger is not likely to succeed. And the thing that is, for me, are really kind of continues to be thematically most interesting about what and how I approached this film was that I really wanted to make a picture where there were no horribly tragic depictions of any particular group, right? The white folks in the film are all well-meaning. They're quite good people. There may be a tad bit of clumsiness, but you know, that is just kind of the circumstances of their engagement with Bigger. And the Black folks are not ill-meaning. You know, everyone's kind of invested in moving forward and making the world no more complicated for one another, yet still something incredibly tragic happens. And the question then arises, what produced this problematic, right? If it wasn't conjured by the individuals, right? A lot of film that intends to explore more complex issues around racial integration and entanglement oftentimes posits a character as being quite evil. Whether if you know, some example would be not allowing the Black female astronaut folks, I can't remember the title of this film, where there were the Black women scientists who helped NASA develop the rocket, and there's this white antagonist who then refuses to allow them to use a bathroom, right? Hidden Figures, someone wrote, thank you. Who won't allow them to use a bathroom. So there's this kind of evil character. And if you create these evil characters, what it does is it allows an opportunity for the audience to not see themselves as part of the kind of critical problem that arises as a result, because they can kind of relieve themselves of responsibility because they are better than this kind of complicated and dark character that's been produced. One of the main goals of this film was to never give anyone that agency or that opportunity, to essentially make everyone somewhat good. Yet why, does something horrible happen? And it makes you start to examine the institutional concern, right? The concerns that go beyond the individual engagement and that are inherent and built in systemically to the condition of these folks' engagement. And that also becomes one of the reasons that this film kind of ideally generates some new ways of examining some old themes.
Yeah, and that trope you referred to in terms of violence, of having a violent character sort of take the baggage off of our shoulders, or take the responsibility off of our shoulders, is in a way offered to Bigger in the film toward the I won't give anything away, but when he's listening to Beethoven's Ninth, that I have got to believe is an allusion to Clockwork Orange. And of course, Beethoven's Ninth is a trigger for Malcolm McDowell's violence. But in this case, it's you see the character just going into this reverie, this beautiful, like poetic kind of enjoyment of this great work of art. So
he falls in love. And again, it's one of those almost contradictory positions, or those positions that create dichotomies, are unexpected kind of collisions, in that we've of course produced a Black character who lives in an unexpected body with unexpected costuming, unexpected reference points, being his relationship to punk music, et cetera. But he's also quite interested and invested in classical music, which kind of takes us to a place that we don't expect for that character. So his kind of inability to be pigeonholed, right? And the fluidity to which the character kind of exposes us is something that I hoped would better illustrate who I am and who I know a lot of my friends are, which are quite complicated people with unexpected ambitions, histories, concerns, and ways of seeing the world.
Absolutely. Maybe Yadira, if we can move to the next slide, which is a detail of a couple of Anxious Men from your 2015 Drawing Center exhibition of the same title. Can you tell us about it? This is kind of a segue to a conversation about the hikers, but can you maybe tell us a little bit about the history of this series and how it relates to notions of Blackness in the hikers?
Yeah, absolutely. This series is a quite complicated one for me, in that my work, my background, was really centered in a lot of kind of critical and oftentimes academic concerns in art and art history. I didn't necessarily early on aspire to making work that would in any way suggest the specifics of a time to which we lived, to a work or a group of works that were wholly invested in gesture, invested in the prescience of exploring the now space. But my work has kind of evolved into doing that, and to bringing in these kind of autobiographical kind of concerns as part of how it navigates the world. And so this body of work is one that's born of me going through a lot of personal transitions. One being, fatherhood. My son at the time was quite young, trying to figure out how to teach someone to explore complicated conditions. We've become so thick-skinned, all of us, in our experiences. We have so much knowledge, so much familiarity. We're so tough, right? And when you're exposed to a person who does not necessarily have those scars and isn't necessarily ready to experience or doesn't know exactly how to experience those things, and then you're forced to prepare them for them, it's just so complicated. And so, a lot of my anxiety at that moment was centered around that. I had stopped drinking, so there was this kind of autobiographical examination of my own sobriety and what the world would look like without the goggles that I had previously had in order to move through it. It's funny, actually, I ran into you once, Michael, at the Russian Turkish bathhouse in Chicago, which is a place that I would go to when I was in graduate school, and then I've continued to go, that has white tiles on the wall, and it's a place where you sit in the schwitz and you sweat and you kind of let out whatever it was that you brought in. During my time in graduate school, I was going to this Russian Turkish bathhouse. I was reading Kierkegaard. I was reading Derrida, The Gift of Death. I was reading Deleuze and Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus. I was like kind of taking in all of this kind of critical, complicated language. And just a quick anecdote that's funny, the first time I went to that Russian Turkish bathhouse, to which I saw you, and this is 20 odd years or so ago, I walked in the door. I was a little bit broken. My friend told me, you need to go to this place. You have all this anxiety, go sweat it out. The first person I see in the room as I walk in is Jesse Jackson. And he's butt naked and he looks at me and he offers me a knee-high orange soda, for anyone who remembers the knee-high orange soda. And I remember thinking, where the hell am I? I'm in this basement with Jesse. And, I just started going there almost every day because it was this kind of place to relieve the stress that was building up around, grad school, all these other kind of things that I was experiencing at the time. And the backdrop in that space was this white tile. And as I moved to New York and started thinking about my relationship to anxiety and other things I was experiencing, I found this white tile to be this space of catharsis and this space of examination. And I started to build up these characters using black soap and wax on their surfaces, really as self-portraits, as I was like, looking at a world that was increasingly complicated. The murder of Mike Brown was happening around the time that I made these works. And then again, some of the other references, both the sobriety and fatherhood, all kind of coming together to make me say, I need to depict this. I need to illustrate this. And when I did the exhibition and I showed them for the first time, and an audience came to see them, they all looked at them. Well, several people at least looked at them and they said to me, that's me. And my first instinct was, no, that's me. That's me. And I came to realize that it was an opportunity to illustrate something that felt more collective as a concern than only personal. And from there, the body of work really expanded because I felt like I was a voice of us more than a voice of myself exclusively.
Oh, absolutely. They do have this kind of everyman quality to them. And I think we all can relate. Or at least I can certainly. And I know that I've had my own shields in terms of anxiety, whether it's alcohol or tobacco or humor is a good shield for anxiety. When you're the happy-go-lucky person making jokes, takes a lot of pressure off.
I've used them all.
Yeah. So thank you for that beautiful summary of the evolution of this body of work. And my mind's blown that those tiles at the Russian Turkish bath, it has a new name now. What's it called? Red Square.
Red Square, yeah.
Maybe they should change their name these days. But Red
Probably.
Square, yeah. And I would see J.C. Jackson there all the time. It's crazy. I think he may have been there when you and I were there together.
I think he was.
Because I thought, oh my God, two amazing superstar people, brilliant people in the same. Anyway, I won't belabor that, but it was great just to see you there. But it's a great segue to the hikers, and maybe Yadira, we're going to see a montage that the studio put together for us. Rashid, may I ask you to kind of maybe walk us through the narrative arc of the film?
Yeah, I'll give you a little context, and then I can talk a little bit about the narrative arc. I was asked to be a resident at the Aspen Art Museum. I believe it was 2018. I'd spent quite a bit of time in Aspen previous to that. I really kind of loved the mountains. I've come to appreciate them in a way that I'd never expected, being a boy from the Midwest. And I remember wondering what it was, or thinking what it was I would do there during the course of this residency, which was sometime on the ground and sometime away to think about it. On one of my first visits to consider what it is I wanted to do, I took a hike, which was not uncommon for me in my time in Aspen. And I remember wondering, are recognizing that I'd never seen another person of color on a hike that I hadn't brought with me. And that was interesting, wondering and thinking about the Black body in space, which has been something in my work that's lived for quite some time, and thinking about commonality, thinking about love, thinking about engagements that are unexpected. And I kind of conjured in my head this story of a man moving up the mountain who confronted someone who he didn't expect to see. And then the kind of platonic love that was born of that, which for a lot of communities is quite familiar. When I see, which isn't uncommon, a Black person in a space where I don't expect to see a Black person, there's always kind of a little bit of a moment. And I don't think that this is exclusive to Black and Brown communities. I think that anyone who sees someone whom they don't expect in a condition or space to which they don't expect to see them, maybe has this moment of almost wondering, in, to take it into, again, like almost an existential position, like whether they're seeing themselves in a sense.
For me, the same thing when situations where I've discovered another gay person in the room in a situation where there's just discomfort. It's like, and all of a sudden, this person provides this comfort and this kind of pleasure, joy, not pleasure.
Absolutely, 100%. So this film really speaks to those experiences, and it kind of takes them into this different context and becomes this balletic story that was choreographed by a woman named Claudia Schreier, who is really fantastic and brilliant, and helped me bring this to life with a couple of dancers. One, Lloyd Knight, who is brilliant and one of the principals at the Graham Dance Company in New York, and another young man's name, Brockington, Derek Brockington, who was in the dance theater in Harlem, who is really an incredible talent. And one is ascending in the film, and the other is descending, and then they have this moment of entanglement.
So let's take a look at that. Yadira, thank you very much for setting it up for us. Beautiful. It's a 7 minutes, a few seconds long, the film. And just to point out to our Atlanta audience, Claudia Schreier is also the choreographer in residence at the Atlanta Ballet. So we can claim her as one of our own. And of course, the music was composed by Antoine Baldwin, who was an important collaborator in Antoine's organ, of course. So I was, how am I trying to say this? We talked about Native Son at the first part of our program intentionally because I felt like both that book and your film provided a narrative parable of the condition of being trapped physically and psychologically within the confines of American racism, kind of a prison without bars. So we saw the first few seconds, about 30 seconds of the film, the drumming, and then there is this moment where the two hikers approach each other and sort of a swaggering bravado. Is this in a way a conception of this kind of condition of this sort of psychological condition of being trapped in this system and having your shields up?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. I had a few very specific instructions for Claudia as we started to imagine how we wanted the dancers to move through space. And one thought was that I wanted them to move through space as if they were completely unwitnessed, right? So imagining the body, in particular the Black body, moving unmolested without the kind of concern of certain kind of witnessing and the clumsiness that could be born of that. We've always, and we consistently continue to, imagine the Black body oftentimes in sexualized positions as well as in positions of great grace, right? And rhythmic grace, as well as athletic feat, right? So we imagine it as being quite dynamic and quite capable. I wanted to see what it felt like for it to move with a different sense of rhythm, a sense of like kind of entangled and complicated rhythm. The characters kind of move through and you see their bodies kind of speaking a language that honestly felt quite unfamiliar and that Claudia helped me bring to life in a way that I wasn't even sure what it was I was looking for. But to your point of the framework of racism being kind of the boundary to which a work like this lives, I would actually push back against that a little bit and suggest that this work lives within the framework of love, right? And the possibilities of love. And the reason I say that is the suggestion here for me is that if you can love someone that you don't know, mm-hmm. if you're rooting for someone that you've never met, for whichever reason that is, it can be a shared characteristic, a shared aesthetic. If you can root for someone that you don't know, then you're capable of love, right? And what I really wanted for these characters in this, what opportunity I wanted to give them was for them to love one another in ways that we couldn't have predicted, right? And that's really, however kind of foolish that may even sound, right? That really was one of the big goals of this film.
That's so beautiful. And I know what you mean when you say kind of foolish, because it's kind of, to tell you the truth, I had self-doubts about the entire exhibition because that's what the exhibition is really about. You just summarized the exhibition, and I knew it when I saw this film in Istanbul. It was being shown at the Istanbul Biennial. And I was the only one in the space at the time, and I thought it was the greatest gift. I just stayed for like a half hour. I couldn't stop watching it. It was so wonderful. And that moment, that critical moment where they meet, and this platonic love blossoms, and all of a sudden the sort of awkwardness that you described becomes this beautiful pas de deux ballet that is just where they not only see each other in themselves, but they become each other.
Conjoined.
Enjoying.
Absolutely.
It's super beautiful, and it reminds me of one of the I guess literary sources it reminded me of is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which Martin Luther King retells in Strength to Love in this beautiful way, where two hikers, two travelers are going up and down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and when anyway, it just
Great reference point, and one that is not lost on me. Absolutely.
And so you mentioned coming back to the collaboration of the film, which is collaborations are not easy, right? They're often far more complex and time-consuming than individual projects. And you had a lot of collaborators here. You had Antoine Baldwin and Claudia Schreier, the dancers, as well as a crew for the film. How do you find yourself managing big collaborations like this? Do they work well? How do you function sort of as the manager? I'm sorry, this is maybe a boring question, but for me.
No, not at all. Actually, it's really, it's quite astute and I think important to understanding how something like this comes to fruition. And I say that because I've joked in the past that artists are oftentimes not the best directors and collaborators, right? Because we are more often than not praised for our individual thought, and we are given agency to live in our egos, right? We're really given agency to live in our egos and to explore and discuss and imagine only the way that we've seen the world, right? And so I've joked that curators are would make far better filmmakers because they're really invested in dealing with lots of different egos constantly. And as a director and as a collaborator in a project like this, it's about those navigations of those egos, right? It's about giving everyone space to sing and to flourish and to do what it is they do best over the course of the project. And it was a real learning curve for me to not necessarily put at center my own concerns, right? And it continues to be a learning curve as I examine and explore future projects and continue to be a collaborator. But having made Native Son and then having made this film and other projects that I've worked on with Antoine Baldwin, with Claudia Schreier, with Maddie Libatique, with Ashton Sanders, and the list goes on, it's really led me to being even more invested in creating vehicles for folks outside of myself. I'm super capable of creating vehicles for myself in the form of my painting, sculpture, and even to some degree in my filmmaking. But I'm also like equally interested at this point in creating vehicles and opportunities to just amplify the voice of others. And it's incredibly rewarding for me in that sense. And I can have that dichotomy in me. You know, I don't have to be only someone who cherishes and examines and tries to find space for themselves in the world. I can do both things. And it's oftentimes we're told that we can't. And if there's anything that I can give the folks who are who have stuck with us this long, is that you don't have to be one thing. And if you are, you're doing it wrong.
Great. It's a great place for us to stop. And if I may say, I think you're a brilliant director, not only of films, but as a director in a multi, person collaboration and however that collaboration takes form. So the success of a film like Native Son, commercial film, or Hikers is testament to that. So I appreciate it very much. I think this is a good time. We have 5 minutes to take some questions. I think what we are going to ask you to do, and I should have done this up front, I apologize, is put them in the chat room, and they're going to be forwarded to me by Yadira. So we'll wait for my prompt. But in the meantime, Rashid, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, no, I was happy to be here. This format can be difficult, I think, for everybody. Sometimes it's great for the audience because you can like wash dishes and do these things.
Right.
But it's always complicated, being this mediator that we have now claimed as a big part of our lives is a challenging one.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't look like we have any questions, so I'll stop looking at that box so I can focus on you. I've enjoyed this kind of format over the pandemic, and I think there's a lot of value in it. The one thing I just can't, I'm like a kid, I'm like a dog, and there's like a squirrel. There's a little squirrel that keeps popping up there, bugging me.
I have a similar issue.
So I'm really bad at the question Q&A thing, but we don't have any cues. So it's a good time for me to, again, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Rashid, you're a brilliant friend, and I cherish you and your work so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks for everybody who came to see us.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Bye.